Okay, so for the second part of the workshop, we are going to do some basic interaction, apply some basic interaction kinds of filtering things on our visualization. So remember that we had this feature on Tableau where you're using, we could select data and then see the data corresponding data, or we could like draw a rectangle and like select a range of data, an area in our graph, and those features are not available in static graphs like this. So for example, sometimes I just want to see what is this data, I want to select that data, I want to select a range of data and see how it goes. So to implement these interactions, first I need to define two main concepts, condition and selection. So what is a selection? What is selection? So selection is an attribute in Vega-Lite that is a block in Vega-Lite that makes it possible for you to map user input such as mouse clicks, such as touch and press and things, and hover to map it into data inquiry. Therefore, we can select different types of data, including single point, multiple data, or an interval or an area of data using selection. We use this selection, we define a specific selection, and then we pass that to condition. So before going to the condition, let's see some samples for selection. So I define the selection, I make a selection block, and then we define the selection. It's the name of the selection we are going to use, and then we specify the type of selection we want to have. So this one is single. As I said, it can be different kinds of selection, and based on the type of selection, we can pass different values to it. For example, we can specify what kind of selection are we looking for. Are we looking for selection on when we are hovering on our data, when we are clicking on the data, and things like that. For example, here we are defining a selection, and the type is single, and the value for on is when do we want this selection to happen, when the mouse is over our data points. Okay, and then the other concept is condition. So condition is like having a block for if and else clause, as we have in other programming languages. We define a condition, and then we specify the selection name or test that we want to, like the predicate. So if this happens, we want the field or value to be set in a way that we want, and else we have a comma after the parentheses, and after the parentheses for condition we have the else value, else clause. So else, I want the field to be some other way. For example, I specify the selection, and so said, okay, if my point selection, as we had in the previous tab, if my point selection occurs, I want one of the fields to change the color, and otherwise I want the value to be gray, something like that. So let's see if we can find an example for it. Yeah, so for example, this is the same selection we had in the previous page, and for the condition we are setting, okay, if the selection as the points here, we put the name of the selection happen, I want to aggregate this, I want this function occurs, I want to aggregate the count, I want to count the number of values, for example. Otherwise I want them to be gray. Otherwise means like for other points that I'm not selecting. Okay, so let's go for what we had here and see if we can get the code for the previous section. copy that and paste it here. So let's add a selection to it. Okay, so for the selection I need to, let's go after mark selection, and then we need to open the block of our selection, close the block, and come up. In the selection we need to specify the name of the thing we want to select, and then that has a block too. What is the type of the selection we want to use? So let's go for the single type, so we can select a single point, and then on, so here you can put click if you want to make it clickable, or you can put something like mouse over. This way whenever you hover your mouse through your data points, a single selection is happening. Then for the color field, so I want to change the color, so I want to make my color dependent to the values of condition. So what I mean is, like, I want a condition to happen when I'm choosing the color. So here I set a condition, and I will keep my indenting correct. Okay, so this is a condition, and then in my condition I first need to specify what selection I'm going to use, or the type, or the field. So the selection I'm going to use is PTS as I defined it here, and then what I want to happen when the selection happens, I want the field of weather, which is nominal, to be to change the color, to get the color. Otherwise I want the value to be gray. So for those points that the selection is happening, we would have a color based on the weather and the nominal the weather value. Otherwise the color would be gray. And I think, sure, let's run it, see if the parentheses are okay. No. So I have a parenthesis here, and I have a parenthesis here, and then we need another parenthesis, brackets as well. I think that's gonna work this time. Yep. So when I hover over my points, the point that I'm selecting would be color, like would have a single color, and those those points that are not selected would be gray. Voila. However, what is the value that I'm selecting? So if I just hover over a point and I select it, nothing happens. So for that we need to use a tooltip, like having let's close this one and go to the next section as tooltip. Okay. Sorry for the noise. And okay, so what is tooltip? Tooltip is the same thing as we had in Tableau, that we could hover over data and see what's the data. So let's take a look at what we have in tooltip documentation. So tooltip can be a field for different parts. For example, if I set it as a mark, as another argument for mark value, then it's gonna show me the y and x axis values. Or I can specify what type of data I want to see. So if we set the content as data, we can see the whole data when we hover over points. Or we can specify another field that we're using in encoding. We specify another field, and so when I hover over it, it shows, for example, the value corresponding to B. So let's do that. Let's go back to the encoding section and define a toolkit. And let's see what is the value for maximum of temperature. So the field would be temp max, and the type would be, again, quantitative. And if I run this one, whenever I hover over my points, I can see the value for maximum temperature. This way, when I hover here, I can see, okay, this is minus 1.6, and what's the maximum? If we count this as maximum, it's 35.6. You can also pass the whole data. So instead of like showing one, instead of specifying one argument only, we can set the whole content as a whole, like set the content as the whole data. This way, when I hover over my points, I see all of the values corresponding to that specific row, including maximum temperature, wind, weather, and so on, and the date, definitely. Okay, so this way we've learned how to select a single point, but how can we select an area? Getting back to the interaction to selection documentation, we can do the single selection, we can do the multiple selection, or we can do the interval selection. And this interval selection has these properties as like binding in and different values, but the usage would be the same. So for example, you can set the zoom as true or false. That way, if we select an area, it would zoom on that part, and so on. So let's go back to the selection section. Oh no, let's copy this one, unpin it, and go to the interval, paste. Okay, so now in the selection section, I want to define another selection. Let's call it area, and this area would have the type of interval, and so I can use it here. Like from now, I can use this one instead of the previous one. So I want the same thing happen, but this time for area. So when I select multiple of them, I see that they changed the color, but the single selection won't work anymore. What if I want to use both of them? So what if I want the selection, the condition applies, the selection happen if I select a single point or I select multiples? For that, we can use multiple selection. So let's make it brackets, and define another properties too, or we can put it as and. So this time here it doesn't make sense, but and would be like if these two properties apply at the same time. But now I want to use or. So if the area selection happens or point selection happen, if either of these happen, I want the color to be changed. So this way, if I select a single point or an area, then it's gonna show me those values. Okay, so for the next section, we want to select from attribute. This was interesting. So we've had this idea of selecting multiple values, but we had this feature in we had this feature in Tableau that we could select for example a country and see all data related to that country. Let me get back to where I was here, and binding, placing. Okay, so let's see the binding. Remember that we had this feature that we could select, for example, Europe, and then the only data would be up here for Europe. What we want to do is to implement the same thing for our own data, so that we can specify and select a range of data based on the filter we are applying to it. Okay, so so here in the selection, what happens here is the selection is gonna happen based on like condition wise. So I need to specify another selection, but this selection would be binded to a set of options. So I define a new selection, for example, as country, and this selection has its type, the same thing. So the type would be single, because I want to specify single points and not, I want to work with single points, not the range of data. And the field, we specify the field we want to work on. So I want to have option, so the field will be weather, and why are you gray? Okay, and then we need to bind this selection with another input that is going to be chosen from a set of options. So we're binding this with input. So if I select from one of these inputs, including, so I specify the options that I have. Let's go back to the binding. What you do is to select an input, kind of input you want to pass, and then a set of options that you want to choose from. And these options would be the origin that is going to be selected for you. So I'm going to do here, I need to put different weathers because the field I'm doing the selection on is weather. So it's going to be no, or drizzle, or what was the other weathers? Fog. Rain, snow, and sun. These are my options, and so the same thing happens here too. So I need to, instead of using the selection as these two, I'm going to use the new selection I defined, which is country. We binded the input as to select, and we binded the weather with the options that we want to put, and this way we can specify each of the values. So like a few, one of them are snow, maybe really less than that is drizzle, and let's see, for the sunny days, most of the days are sunny. Okay, so this was doing like applying the options and binding the these options with the select value. However, we had something like we had this slider that we could filter in Tableau. Something like that would be much more useful for us, like to interactively change the values we want to see in our data. For that, I'm going to use the range slider I defined, so to filter our data. So if you remember, I defined a range slider here, imported a range slider. You can take a look at the documentation here. So what you want to do is to, instead of finding the value for those options with our data, we want to define a range slider and use this range slider as a filter so that we can filter our data. So for applying the filtering, we use, so first let's make that range slider. So we define a function, we define a function for that, and we use view, and the function name would be range, and like make an object of that range value, range slider, and then we need to pass a set of parameters, set a set of parameters for that. Okay, the first one is the minimum, so it's like the minimum value of the range that can be chosen, which is, for example, in this data, the minimum value would be the minimum value of temperature. So G3, if you remember that mean, and from that I'm gonna pass data to it, and I'm gonna get the d dot temperature. I'm gonna use the temperature max column from those data. And the same thing for maximum. So the two first values are minimum and maximum of the range. Data and d dot max. Cool. Okay, and then we need to specify the value. What is the range of the value for the output? So we made a condition value, and so if you needed some functions, some built-in functions like this, you don't need to write them from the scratch. You just need you can easily search them and find something like the range slider that we found here, and then see the code, see the samples, and then use it based on that sample. That's what I'm technically doing right now. And then you can define a title for that, which is maybe the temperature, and the description. Filtering by temp. Okay, so on this one, you can see that this is the slide bar. The maximum is the maximum range of temperature. The minimum is the minimum temperature, and this is a range that is the normal range that can be seen. We can change it, so it's from 0 to 20. You can change the first range, the default range here. Okay, now we can use this range and design add filter to our data, to our plot. And here, and so for that we need to use a let me check something. So for that we use a property named transform. This transform, by using this transform we can apply some filter to our data. So using transform, then we need to put this after defining the data. Let's put square brackets, and then inside the square bracket we define our filters. So this is the first filter and the second filter for the lower and the higher range. So I'm gonna define a filter, and this filter we need to pass a field to our filter. So what do we want to apply the filter on? I want to apply the filter on temperature max, and then I want what the filter is going to be. It's going to be less than or equal to the range, the first value in the output of range. So this 0 to 20 is the output, and then I'm gonna read the first, like the second one, which is the second value, and then so I want it to be less than the upper limit and greater than the lower limit. So another filter for lower limit, filter field, again temperature max, and this time it's going to be greater than or equal, and range the first one. So we need to transform, and then we need to define the width and height, and let's run this one. So now I got the filter for my data, and whenever this filter is linked to the slide bar, range slider I have here, and so if I increase the range, I can view different range of my values. So it's like I'm removing the lower temperature or the higher ones. Cool. So this was for the first the simple interactions. We've learned how to select a point, how to select an area, and we've learned that we can bind different parts of our data together, our visualization together, and we've learned how to define a filter or scale. And in the next step, in the next part, we're going to see how we can have multiple visualization next to side by side, and then how to link them together.